Hi there. My name is Lucas Weiss, and I am the host of the Weesesports Quarantine Chronicles. For today's episode, I'm joined by Mark Medina. Mark is a national basketball columnist for USA Today. In this episode, I chat with Mark about his early journalistic assignments, his approach to covering big beats like the Los Angeles Lakers and the Golden State Warriors, and what it was like to be the last journalist to have a sit-down interview with the late Kobe Bryant. The Weesports Quarantine Chronicles is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. So make sure to like, rate, watch, and subscribe to all three of those channels. This is episode 22 of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. All right, on today's episode of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles, I am joined by Mark Medina. He is a basketball reporter for USA Today. Mark, thanks so much for coming on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. How are you?
I'm doing well, all things considered, and thanks for having me on, and hope you and yours are hanging in there during these tough circumstances.
We are. It's, challenging, but, hey, there's opportunities to, produce content like this. I feel like if there were live sports on, we'd be out on the road covering events, but hey, you're talking with me now. So it's crazy how things can change. But I wanted to start off because normally I do this with writers who come on the show. I found a piece that you wrote back in 2008 with the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and it was on the annual Soapbox Derby. And I'm just curious what you remember of that event, and what was it like to cover an event that was, really well known in that area, but, maybe not as well known to the general population.
Wow, you really dug into the well there. As far as what I remember about the Soapbox Derby, I remember the story hit on just kind of what went into making it, as far as the model car and all that. And it was pretty interesting because it's much more than just, hey, you have this little derby car that you roll down. I mean, there's a lot of strategy involved. But the example you cited with, my times at the Richmond Times-Dispatch, it was a very good kind of symbol for what that whole experience at that specific paper entailed. Because one, it's a very good newspaper, but you're also working in a market in Richmond, Virginia, where, there's a lot of stuff going on, but the reality is there's no professional sports teams. So it really called on me to be creative. So when I was an intern, I did a few features with the Richmond Braves because, that was a minor league baseball team. Sometimes there's some IndyCar events coming into town. There's some high school sports. And then it was things like this Soapbox Derby tournament. And, regardless of what you're covering, whether it's those things or the NBA, a good story is a good story. So it's just a matter of finding it and then getting the reporting, getting the interesting nuggets, and trying to write it well. So
it's certainly different than covering the NBA Finals, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, you fast forward 2 years later, 2.5 years after that, and it's Game 7 of the 2010 NBA Finals between the Los Angeles Lakers and the Boston Celtics. But I mean, just kind of rewinding it back even before that, what's really interesting is that specific game. I was covering that game for the Los Angeles Times as a Lakers blogger, and a good friend of mine, Dave McMenamin from ESPN, he was also covering that. We both went to Syracuse University for college, and what's surreal is 6 months before that, we were both covering a Big East field hockey playoff game. So it's just really surreal, the 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon, and just where you are all over the map. You might be covering things that no one really knows about, and then the pinnacle of all sporting events, right? So.
Well, and look, I think a lot of young sports reporters and journalists, they, that's what they got to do to start out, right? Like they don't get that, beat reporter job of, an NBA team. They got to go cover a Soapbox Derby or do the field hockey beat to gain that experience. But you mentioned about going to Syracuse, and I've had a few reporters on the show who also went there. And I'm just curious for you, Mark. I mean, you went at a time when social media didn't dominate the journalism and media landscape like it does today. But did you feel like at Syracuse you were being taught a multitude of different skills that enabled you to have success in the industry?
That's an interesting question. I went to Syracuse from 2004 to 2008. And so during that time period, it's not like I was covering a journalism area that's like a dinosaur right now, right? It was on the precipice of a lot of changes happening. Newspapers were starting to go on the decline. There's heavier emphasis online. A lot of convergence is taking place with blogs, writers being able to appear on the radio or TV sports programs. So the writing was very clear on the wall of where the industry was headed, that it was going to be a lot of change, and it called for being able to have a multitude of skills. I think the unknown is what exactly would that entail. So I certainly did not think, oh, there's going to be Twitter and Instagram, all that stuff. So with that, I was there at a time where we knew where things were headed in terms of change, but without the clarity of what that change exactly would be. So to answer your question, Syracuse University, don't get me wrong, a great school. I owe a lot of gratitude to. It has a great reputation, but at the time, the way their journalism program was structured, it was very traditional. You had your newspaper journalism majors and magazine journalism, broadcast journalism. And so because a lot of my experience during my early years at Syracuse were more on newspaper, and I had a lot more internships there, where with the TV side, I had some experience, but not as much hands-on experience, I decided to major in broadcast journalism with the idea that if I majored in a print major, I wouldn't learn as much, number one. And number two, I wouldn't have as many of those multimedia skills. So I majored in broadcast with no aspirations to be a play-by-play announcer or a sports anchor or a field reporter. I came in there wanting to pick up whatever skills that I would need to be competent enough for me to appear as an analyst on a sports show or make a radio hit. And so I think by the time I graduated, those skills all came in line where I was a pretty attractive candidate, where I was a writer that had all this experience with all these different newspapers, but I could also tell people, look, I'm comfortable speaking in front of a camera. I've been on radio before. I know how to shoot video. I have all these different skill sets. And so the fact that I had that, and the fact that I was entering the job market as social media was evolving, I really try to market myself as being very versatile and open to being able to tap into whatever tools you needed in those toolboxes to be able to adjust to all these different things going on in the industry.
And while you were at Syracuse, you did a lot of different activities. As you said, writing for the school newspaper, you covered the field hockey beat, among other sports, and you also did a lot of internships as well. And I'm just curious about, because for a lot of young writers and reporters, I find getting that hands-on experience early on is so vital in going forward, because while the classroom teaches you a lot of important, theories and skills, it's getting in the newsroom. It's learning how to interview athletes or coaches. It's covering games where you can really hone your skills and really develop your craft, which you can take for the rest of your career.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I say this without impugning Syracuse at all. It's more of a credit to all the other experiences I had than any sort of disrespect to them. But the reality is I've learned the most with all the hands-on experience I had with different internships. It started back in high school. I grew up in York, Pennsylvania, and I was able to get an opportunity with both working for my student newspaper in middle school and high school, student TV station in high school, but also freelance for my hometown paper, the New York Daily Record. And then by the time I was at Syracuse, I'm writing for the student paper at the Daily Orange, and then each summer interning somewhere inside Lacrosse Magazine, the Washington Times, the Syracuse Post-Standard, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, as you alluded to. And as much as you'd like to think you learn a lot at a really good university like Syracuse, the reality is this industry really calls on for hands-on experience. Mm-hmm. So there's no recipe for that. And then I think the other thing that gets understated is that, take me, for example. I go to a really good journalism school, and by no means am I downplaying the benefits that comes with in terms of opportunities, both while I was at school and post-graduation with job opportunities. But the reality is it's a lot of times a sink or swim mentality at either a really good journalism school that has a lot of interested prospects, or at a journalism school that's not as high profile, where maybe you don't have as much of that self-motivation and the resources. And so I think with that, it really calls on for you to take that initiative, to take whatever you can in terms of experience and then embrace it. And then I think an offshoot of that that's really important is when you're getting these opportunities, to realize that at that point, you're really not in this position to be selective. So what I mean by that is, I grew up in York, Pennsylvania. The best opportunities I had because of what was available and because of my experiences just covering high school sports and in college, starting out as a field hockey reporter. And if you have this attitude coming in that, oh, that's something that's beneath me, I'm not really interested in that, I just want to cover the NBA, the less likely you are going to be able to cover the NBA, because the reality is you have to start somewhere where there isn't that much of a demand. You have a room to make mistakes and learn on the fly and develop before, there are media outlets that are comfortable with giving you such a high profile position. So with all that, sometimes I get inquiries from different aspiring students who want to get in this field, and they say, hey, I'm a huge NBA fan. I read your work. I want to be an NBA writer. What's your advice? And frankly, sometimes that's a red flag to me that they're saying my goal is to be an NBA writer, because I think that sometimes it diminishes what should be important at that time, which is get as much hands-on experience and skills as you can. And if you do that, the chips will eventually fall where they fall. And for me, there's no way around it. I grew up loving sports, preferably the NBA, but I love, following football and baseball. And for sure, maybe at that point I thought, hey, it would be great to cover an NBA team. But when I was in high school and college, I also knew the realities of the industry. And so with that, I did not have in the back of my mind, oh, I want to be an NBA writer. It was, I want to get whatever hands-on experience I can get. And then once I was in college, the whole goal that I had was by the time I graduate, I want to be able to get a full-time position wherever. And then, if that is a position that's, at a small paper that's just covering preps, eventually use that as a launching pad to get into a beat writing position that's covering either a major or pro basketball or football team. So, the higher that I got these opportunities, I was able to, really focus and alter a little bit of my goals. But I think if you have that at the beginning, sometimes having that mindset dilutes the thought process of how important it is just to embrace whatever experience you can get.
You hit the nail on the head, and I think the point about, not being selective and taking what you can get is so vital, because look, like there's very few opportunities in today's, media market. And I think that for people to get those reps, you gotta, sometimes, cover the high school sports or cover the beats that not many people know about. But if you can do a really good job of that, those skills can then translate to other leagues or even higher up leagues in different sports. And it's all about the journey, right, Mark? Like, I think, it wouldn't be, I think everyone likes to get that quick expressway to being an NBA writer, but you gotta have those steps in the journey before you can, be there at an NBA finals reporting on, the Lakers or the Warriors eventually in your case.
Yeah, and I think you hit on a lot of good points I'd like to build on, is that even with things that I said, it's still good to think big picture and maybe have a 1-year, 5-year plan of, hey, what are your big picture goals, so that you can tackle each day satisfying whatever day-to-day needs that you need to hit on and that your editor is asking of you, but also put yourself in a position where you're doing impact stories that can help you down the line. But the other thing is, I think people have to keep in mind that everyone's journey is different. So for me, I'm saying all these things, but I am also blessed that my first job out of high school or out of college was an internship with the LA Times. So I was able to maybe fast track that a little bit, work for a high profile paper. But the reality is that opportunity cuts both ways where, I didn't have that luxury of, hey, having my own beat and being able to grow into that and make mistakes. I was, having a good problem to have where it was a sink or swim opportunity where, I have an internship that's not going to have any guarantees where it goes. And it's the LA Times. They have a lot of talented people on their staff. And if you're not good, like, they might not have a reason to keep you. So it was a matter of showing that you're competent, also valuable enough that when you're looking at how there's so much talent with the LA Times and every beat is fulfilled, how do you make yourself helpful? How do you make yourself valuable? So I try to, market myself and also show with my, volume of work that I'm available for anything as far as, being that fill-in guy, also pitching story ideas, doing the multimedia stuff. And the reality is when you're looking at my journey, that helped me, land an entry-level job with them that lasted about a year. But at the same time, I was one of the casualties with their rounds of layoffs. And, I say this, not necessarily knowing directly, hey, this is why we had to let you go, right? But I'm just looking at it objectively beyond the obvious, economic pressures that are going under. If I'm looking at it myself, hey, I'm a young, disposable writer that's not attached to a major beat, right? So, there's only so many things you can do at a high-profile publication off the bat, where if you get an entry-level position somewhere else, maybe you have more opportunity because you're being asked for more. But at the same time, in my circumstance, there weren't any regrets because at the end of the day, I had that experience with the Times, number one. And number two, the stars aligned in however way that I was able to get rehired back in a different position a few weeks later, like 3 weeks later, to run their Lakers blog. And so you kind of look at it where maybe it didn't work out the way you wanted to with being able to climb up the ranks within the LA Times covering a beat, but they were impressed enough with, what I offered them, but also how I handled the tough circumstances of getting let go, that they knew, hey, we need to keep him and have him in some kind of role. And that's what led to where we're at now, where I did that Lakers gig for about 2.5 years. I went to the LA Daily News to be their Lakers beat writer for 5 years, which was a bigger role. I'm now the beat guy. I'm traveling. I did that for 5 years. And then Bay Area News Group was looking for a Warriors beat writer. So I took advantage of that. I thought, look, as much as it's a great opportunity to cover the Lakers, being able to expand my bandwidth and institutional knowledge within the NBA could pay dividends. So I did that for 2 years. And then lo and behold, USA Today was looking for another national NBA writer. And when they offered me the job, one of the things that they liked was the fact that I'm based on the West Coast. They already have a really good NBA writer, my colleague Jeff Zilgett, who's based out east. So all these things tie together where, sometimes you get a break, sometimes you don't, but then it's a matter of what do you do with the cards that you're dealt and where does it lead you? And, sometimes it goes your way, sometimes it doesn't, but I like to think that, where I'm at today really has to go down to the fact that I did as best as I could within my control of tapping into that old cliche of when preparation meets opportunity.
And I'm going to unpack the different parts of the journey conversation, but I want to start with you as a blogger covering the Lakers, especially for the LA Times, which is a print company normally, but this is now, like you said earlier, how we're sort of now getting into this digital world. I'm just curious what it was like for you being a blogger at a time when blogs were starting to become a lot more well-known.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and something that was a theme throughout that time, because I owe a debt of gratitude to my former sports editor, Mike James, who entrusted me with this position, and he gave me a lot of independence to handle the blog how I saw fit. But at the end of the day, I'm also working within a specific set of circumstances where we have two beat writers. We have a handful of columnists that are really good, and Bill Plaschke and TJ Simers and Mark Heisler. And so it's a matter of like, where do you find your lane and make yourself valuable? So I try to tap into, being the guy that was, available to handle any news updates, from practice and from games. Our beat writers were handling their traditional game stories and handling breaking news. So for my game coverage, I would do a mix of, tapping into the multimedia with shooting video, but also doing some more in-depth game analysis, because their game stories, they were very good, goes more into the nuts and bolts and the news of everything. So for me, I can put my analysis hat on. And then also, because it's the internet and there's not as much of a worry about space as it is in the newspaper, I use this as an avenue to do some enterprise stories. So, those approaches that I outlined, I also try to carry into, my time covering the Lakers for the Daily News, the Warriors for the Mercury News, and here the NBA with USA Today, where, there is a premium, especially now as things have evolved, and being able to, get news stories, whether you break it yourself or if it's not, being in a position to confirm and also add some context, extra reporting, analysis, and then also doing some deep dives that entail either an exclusive interview, some enterprise work that you can go in depth with. And so I think, especially now where you're in a flooded marketplace and you're competing in an attention economy, right, where so many people have busy lives, you have to promote stories. Like, how do you get people's attention without diminishing your credibility, right? And I think it's that perfect storm of being able to pivot to some of the day-to-day demands, but also work on some of those long-term projects. And that always comes down to, the ideas, the relationships that you have to pull that off in terms of, any one-on-ones and any reporting, and then just trying to build off of that, because it's a never-ending cycle.
What are the challenges as a beat writer in markets like Los Angeles and the Bay Area, which are just, popular for sports, a lot of attention on their teams, a lot of passionate fan bases, where you have to consistently develop unique new content?
I'll say this: it's an ultimate first world problem to have, because I'm mindful that, hey, there are beats where it's hard to get people to care about, right? Where maybe you're covering, some low profile college teams, or you're covering a professional team in a market that there's just not that appetite. But that being said, I think that reinforced the reason why I tried to do the best I can with satisfying both the day-to-day needs and, the long-term needs, because there's going to be days where, the reality is everyone's kind of exposed to the same material. You're on the whims of some sort of news story, some trade, whatever said at practice. The idea of getting one-on-ones with, these high-profile guys anytime you want is frankly unrealistic. So a lot of the reporting is coming in group interviews at practices or at shoot-arounds. But then it's a matter of coming up with ideas of how do you chip away at something long-term, or even coming into practice with an idea where that there's certain day-to-day things that you need to kind of check off your list. But how do I go into a certain game with an idea that is different from someone else's? And maybe that comes from getting an exclusive with someone, but then also maybe it's the reality that everyone's going to be exposed to that material. But because you came up with that idea, you're asking those people those questions, and you have an early start of kind of how you wanted to frame that story. You might have a head start of differentiating yourself of how you reported and wrote that story compared to everyone else. So I think that has been the theme for my experience covering the NBA, because I've covered all high-profile teams, and now I'm in a league position. I've never had a lack of wondering, okay, how do I write something that people care about? But it's how do you differentiate yourself in a crowded marketplace? And I think that, I don't want to come across as saying I'm the only one who does this, because a lot of people in our field do it. But the best that you can in mastering that seesaw of working hard, but also working smart, I think gives you the most chances to, really hit on some of the short-term stories and also some of the long-term stories.
You mentioned how you covered the Lakers for both, of course, the Times and then the LA Daily News. And I'm sure as a basketball fan, you've had the chance to watch the Last Dance documentary. And I'm just curious how the documentary's portrayal of Phil Jackson compared or contrasted to how you remember covering Phil when he was with the Lakers and winning his 11th and final NBA championship in 2010.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of similar in the sense that we knew what Phil Jackson's philosophies were about in terms of the triangle offense, and his some of the practices that he does with how he manages players and how he handles practices stems from his fascination and appreciation for Native American culture. We knew that he was someone who knew how to manage superstars because, he had a really unconventional coaching style. And then it was one of those things that success breeds success. The more that you build off of that, it snowballs because you have that established credibility. Other than that, I think, the parallels that I personally felt with watching that documentary that I can attest to, both covering the Lakers and the Warriors, is that when you're trying to defend a championship, the challenges continue to multiply because it's the battle of attrition, the fact that you're getting everyone's best shot. And even if these guys are all competitive and they want to win, the idea of having to navigate that again, it is a lot harder to do than the first go around, because sometimes just the newness and freshness of it feels a lot more fun than it does in the other years. And so I certainly witnessed the challenges that the Lakers went through when they're trying to defend their championship in 2010 after winning against Orlando in 2009 and going against Boston. It went 7 games, and it was very clear that, look, like, they have a lot of great experience in Kobe Bryant and Pau Gasol and Derek Fisher and Ron Artest and Lamar Odom, but it took a lot out of them. And it wasn't a good game to watch. Like, it wasn't well played, but you could tell that both teams were at the end of their rope and they're just pouring everything out. And then the following year just kind of carried over, where the injuries and the fatigue and that pressure of being able to win again just kept being too overwhelming. And then they wound up getting swept against Dallas in the second round of the playoffs. And then I also was able to see that with the Warriors. I joined them the season that they won their 3rd championship, the second with Kevin Durant. And so for me, it was a new beat for me. And, I'm kind of engaged with trying to get, acquainted with a new set of characters and all that. But I could tell from just how they're going through, it was one of those seasons that was very much of a malaise, where they're trying to find, how do we keep this engaging and interesting? And they were able to win, but they were tested against Houston in the Western Conference Finals by 7 games. And then that last year, everything caught up to them, where, I mean, there's no way around it. If Kevin Durant and Klay Thompson weren't hurt in the NBA Finals, I think that they would have beaten Toronto in the finals. But that whole season, there was a lot going on with the ongoing speculation of, is this Kevin Durant's final season? And it wasn't just a media manufactured story. It wound up being something that was enough of a point of contention that when Kevin and Draymond Green had their, well-noted blow-up at the end of a game against the Clippers, that Draymond brought those things up. And so that was an ongoing theme throughout that year. And so when I'm watching the Bulls documentary, like beyond the fact that it was cool seeing it, it gave me something to do in this life of quarantine. That was another thing that really struck me, just seeing those parallels that the Bulls had, as well as, the teams that I covered with the Lakers and Warriors.
I want to explore the Warriors a little bit more because it's interesting for me because I find when watching basketball, and I found this watching The Last Dance, that you just appreciate greatness. And, the 90s Bulls winning 6 championships, they were great. And I found with the Warriors, just a basketball fan, they were just so fun to watch, particularly when Kevin Durant came. But Mark, I just felt like it just lasted so short. Like when you think of the talent that they had with Steph, Clay, Kevin, Draymond, that you wish it could have gone longer, but it only lasted really 3 seasons. So I don't know, like for me, like it was, that 2016-17 season especially, I know that you comment on the malaise, but man, like they were just so exciting and dominant to watch that it just felt like no one could touch this team when they were playing and firing on all cylinders.
Yeah, for sure. And the reality is, we're in different eras where, contracts run a lot shorter. And so, the Warriors benefited from that and then wound up not benefiting from it, from the fact that the stars aligned for Kevin Durant to go there because there's much more player movement. Mm-hmm. But I will say, I don't think this is the end of the Warriors run. I think obviously they had a really tough year this year, but a lot of it you can attribute to that perfect storm of, yes, you lose Kevin Durant and that was going to be tough, but to have an injured Klay Thompson and Steph Curry to get hurt in the 4th game, and then there to be such an infusion of young guys, I think that really contributed. Where I think if Klay didn't get hurt, I'm convinced what would have happened is they would have run it back. They would have kept everyone together. They wouldn't have tried to get D'Angelo Russell in a sign-in trade. And the reason why they did that is they want to get something in return. But because they did that move, they wound up having to make financial decisions because they're all of a sudden hard capped. So I think because of that, they wouldn't have traded Andre Iguodala. So I think what this means for next year, I think they're going to have a good pick. All their core guys are going to be healthy. So I think what the Warriors are trying to do is they're trying to make that transition where you can make the argument that era that they had, they were some version of the 90s Bulls, right? Mm-hmm. Now they're trying to transition to be the Spurs of the 2000s, where maybe they're not that dominant team that wins year after year after year, but they're always going to be in the playoffs and they're always going to have a fighter's chance to win a title because of not just the talent that they have, but the corporate knowledge that Greg Popovich likes to say, and that culture, and the fact that, they might be able to set up the perfect scenario that the Spurs did once with Tim Duncan and Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker, where they're able to make Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, those guys, and then it's just a matter of finding those right role players that fit around them to ensure that they can keep the engine running.
I want to dig a little deeper into last year's finals because I'm from Toronto, and many of my listeners.
I put some blasphemy here, huh?
No. You know what? I respect your opinion because I think that like the whole what if about the injuries and whatnot. But I would say though, from that it was interesting to see the rise of some of those younger role players on the Raptors, like a Pascal Siakam or a Fred VanVleet, who I remind you got 12 points in that 4th quarter of Game 6. But from a reporter like yourself, who covers the NBA and recognizes the global scope that this sport has become, how significant is it that a Canadian team won an NBA championship and that you got to cover that as a reporter?
I think it's significant for sure, but I think the great unknown is to what extent. I think that this is a continuation of the NBA and its successful efforts in it becoming a global game. And so the fact that you have a team in Canada winning. I wonder the butterfly effect, right? 10, 20 years from now of, what impact that made on Canadian basketball players and, hey, how that motivated them. I mean, you talk about the Bulls documentary, right? They had a little bit of a segment about the dream team. And when you talk to international players, a lot of times they say, hey, that was the pivot point of what got me interested in basketball. When you talk to Dirk Nowitzki, Pau Gasol, Marc Gasol, they all point to that. So I am really wondering, I'm convinced that there is going to be a butterfly effect like that, but to what extent, who knows? I don't want to say it's going to be equivalent of the dream team, but I think it falls under the same umbrella of the NBA has done such a great job in the last 20, 30 years of being able to expand the game internationally. And that's one of many examples. But the thing is, this is not ending. Like, this is going to be continuously evolving, where they're going to be able to grow the game in different markets. And they're also going to inspire, potential players in those countries to then want to become that next NBA star. And so, the NBA won't reap the benefits of that until, a generation from now. And then that's when we'll have that true answer to the question you asked.
No, for sure. And like, it's, and I know in Canada, like, we've certainly grown since, the Raptors won the championship. And even in that finals, just to see the different Jurassic Parks, it wasn't just in, in front of Scotiabank Arena. It was in, Halifax. It was in Regina. I'm showing my Canadian bias here if you can't tell. But it is just fascinating just to see, how the game is growing and how there's guys now like a Pascal Siakam from Cameroon who could now become the most improved player. So it's just, to me, fascinating. But I do agree with you that, like, it'll be years down the road before we can really see, the growth of the game in different parts of the world.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I'm eager to see where it goes. But I think, the interesting challenge that the NBA has, beyond the fact that, what they're going through right now with the pandemic and the financial impact is, before this all happened, I don't want to say they're going through an identity crisis, but there are a lot of fair questions to be asked of, like, to what extent should the league be concerned of the fact that the TV ratings were taking a huge hit domestically in the United States this year. And, when I talk to people, around the league and people that know how the networks were thinking, they very much qualified that they felt like a lot of these concerns weren't as big of a deal that we were making, because there was this perfect storm of a huge influx of injuries among some of the NBA star players. And look, like, that's part of professional sports. Everyone gets injured. But I can't think of a time compared to this season where you had so many key guys out off the bat, and Zion Williamson, Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Kevin Durant, Kawhi Leonard's doing his load management.
Yep.
Paul George was missing the first, I think 11 games of the season. And so the reality is, like, it's a star-driven league, so there's no way around it. But that being said, there were a lot of, I think, fundamental questions to be asked of, hey, the NFL still rules in the United States. But I think the other thing is, how does the NBA find these regular season games to be meaningful when unintentionally the league, the media, the players, they've put less importance in those games because of just, players sitting out, the fact that, I think people are more sophisticated and they know that regular season results don't necessarily mean something definitive in the playoffs, right? So, like, how do you get those fans engaged in that when those things are going on? And so that will be interesting to see how the NBA comes out of this, because they're obviously going through a huge challenge right now financially, and who knows how long, it takes for them to get back to normal. And I say that, knowing that, look, the NBA by and large is going to be fine, especially compared to I think the real tragedy going on with small businesses and people who are out of work. But is this going to be something that kind of prompts the NBA to change their scheduling because they might have to anyway, where they start the season, maybe around next season around Christmas time or in the winter, so they don't have to compete with the NFL? Or, do they at least restructure the way the 82 game season is to attach more importance? I think the reality is this, and I know I'm kind of speaking out of both sides out of my mouth here, but I don't fault players and teams for being proactive with sitting out games. Like, I think they're being smart. And as long as they're not sitting out games because they need a rest or sitting out games that they're hurt, that's fine. And that, the science has shown that will prolong players' careers. But that being said, there needs to be, I think, an attitude adjustment about the way the league is covered, where getting away from all the free agency speculation and the social media nonsense, and put more focus on the games. And look, like, I'm part of the media, and I don't want to say you shouldn't cover free agency and all that. Like, that's part of the business. That's the business of basketball. But there has come to a point where a lot of times it's like it's moths chasing the light, chasing the flame. And I don't think the media should be putting more importance on games in particular. Like, we know it's all about the playoffs, and it's about how you pace yourself and handle your resources for the marathon. But I think there needs to be, more sophistication of covering these things, that we aren't, just chasing all those things on social media all the time. And, I think that a lot of outlets do that, but there could be more of that, where, there's not as much of the aggregation, all that stuff. But it's easier said than done because of the economic pressures and just the world that we're in these days.
Well, of course. And you talk about free agency, and I think you hit the nail on the head that, while it's so important, like the whole Moths idea, like I think of Kawhi Leonard last year, like the whole idea of, is he going to stay in Toronto? Is he going to the Lakers? Is he going to the Clippers? Like that just, speaks to your point entirely. But you ask a lot of questions that a national reporter for USA Today might ask. And it's my fancy way of segueing to how you are now the national reporter for USA Today. And I'm just curious, Mark, compared to being a beat writer for a team, how do you decide what pieces or stories to focus on now that you have the entire NBA landscape to focus on?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, it's an ongoing thing that you have to figure out. I think, philosophically, my colleague Jeff Zilgett, he lives out east, I live out west. I'm based in LA. So some of it by design, I'll handle a lot of, any high profile news going on with the Lakers, Clippers, because I'm in their backyard. But I also traveled a lot to different parts of the Western Conference. So, both my editors and I, we would pitch different ideas of, hey, when is a good time to go to Houston, do some Rocket stories, the Pelicans, the Oklahoma City Thunder, like whatever's going on. And I think, we always had to determine, what resonates on a national level, not only for like covering an NBA, story, but also the fact that USA Today is catered to a general interest audience of like everyone, right? So I think because of that, what I've tried to do, and it's a lot of trial and error, but it's also, you have a system where you try to pitch trend stories, enterprise stories, get interviews with some of the high profile, players in the league. When there's something that big that happens, be able to jump on it. I think a perfect example, tragically this year, was, what happened with Kobe Bryant and Gianna, where obviously that's going to be a huge story regardless. But the fact that, I had covered the Lakers, I'd covered Kobe's final 7.5 seasons, incidentally enough, I did a story on his post-NBA career 9 days before he passed away, and it was published 4 days before that. Like, that gave me, kind of an avenue of being able to provide a lot of perspective on a really tragic story, and also geographically be in a position to handle daily developments because I live in LA. So I would go to the memorial sites. I go to the different availabilities the Lakers had, and when he had his memorial down Staples Center a month later. So it's this ongoing process of kind of using LA as my backyard and try to do, some feature stories on both LA teams and visiting teams coming in, but then also try to travel to different parts of the Western Conference. And then, when there's league stories that come up, Jeff and I will coordinate either, working together on something or kind of dividing and conquering and doing our own separate things. So as I'm outlining these things to you, I think there's parallels to what I'm talking about earlier with when I was covering the Lakers and the Warriors. It's this ongoing balance of how you satisfy kind of the day-to-day demands and the long-term demands.
I actually wanted to get to your piece on Kobe because you were the last sit-down interview with Kobe Bryant. And, which is still, 4 months later, it's still hard to believe that he's gone and the way that it was. But when watching that interview that you did with Kobe, I was struck by, how smart, I knew how smart he was, but just hearing him speak and just about him and, talking about his books and Dear Basketball, and of course Gianna and how him and her would go to basketball games. And then you wrote a column, of course, talking about that experience in light of his tragic death. And there's the old, rule about how journalists shouldn't inject themselves into stories. But I thought that in this case, you did a really nice job of that because it was so personal for you. That you interviewed this person and then 10 days later he's tragically passed. So I'm just curious about the interview itself and you writing that column, which was obviously very emotional for you.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the kind words. And frankly, it was a very challenging story to write because, it was a long day. You're trying to process it. I was out in the field in Calabasas because that's where the helicopter crash was, of trying to go to different press conferences. But as far as the thing that you hit on, one, I'm really flattered with the nice words that you shared about how I handled that column. But two, it was something I was really sensitive to because, and I don't want to fault anyone else. Like, there's a lot of different writers that had relationships with Kobe as well as I did. And, how close you were to him, it varied on the person. So, I had a close business relationship to him, maybe closer to others, but then there were others that were closer to him, that covered him longer, right? So with that, there's certainly columns and testimonials where they shared, different inside stories and all that. And I think it's interesting to a reader, but I think for me, I just did not want to kind of dilute the focus of the reason I'm sharing this personal kind of anecdote was, hey, I'm giving you a window into his final days, literally, of just where his mind was. And I also didn't want to come across as like being self-important and trying to like take advantage of it, right? Like, so I was trying to just use my platform of, hey, the reason why I'm injecting myself into this is I interviewed him 9 days ago, and this was kind of the latest window into what he was doing, what his thought process was, like what his end game was, like his other aspirations. And so, there was a lot of self-editing where, I was tempted to share, certain conversations or things that we discussed there that was not part of the interview. And I felt like it was going to get in the way of it. And so maybe there might be a time, at some point, whether it's leading into his Hall of Fame induction or an anniversary where I share that. But then at the same time, those were personal, private conversations, right? And it's not like I'm protecting like CIA secrets, right? But I also didn't want to come across of over exaggerating my connection to Kobe. Like, the reality is I'm a sports writer and so is everyone else. Like, we know these guys on a professional level. And we certainly know them much more than maybe the general public because they're part of our day to day. And we, see them at practice, we see them at games. The more you interview someone, the more you get a sense of like what makes them tick, what they're about. But like, even when you add all those things, it can't compare to someone who knows them as a family member or a close friend or a former teammate. So I don't want to come across as if I'm suggesting that at all. So I decided to kind of make it, I don't want to say sanitized, because I felt like I still gave a lot of perspective and insight, but I also try to self-edit as much as I could to show that the main thrust of why I'm sharing my emotion, sharing kind of my inside baseball a little bit, was to further illustrate the platform of giving insight of Kobe's final days.
My last question for you, Mark, is about being a reporter, when the NBA does come back, because it's going to be very different to when you were covering games earlier this year, and the fact that nothing yet set in stone, but most likely at the beginning will exist without fans. And of course, fans are such an instrumental part. You've been at the Staples Center, you've been at Oracle Arena, Chase Center, where, the fan and the atmosphere is so critical. But I'm just curious what the challenges will be for you as a reporter, especially in this new normal, particularly with no fans, but also potentially with locker room restrictions because of health and safety guidelines.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of unknowns here because it seems like the stars are aligning where the NBA is going to have some sort of season, but because of how fluid this pandemic is, until we know, we don't know. And then once they do know, in the event that there is a season, there's not exact clarity on how teams in the league are going to determine who's essential and who's non-essential. Some of the essentials are obvious: players, most of the coaches, the trainer staff, but there is a gray area of who falls under non-essential. And does that mean we're non-essential, or do they want some media there? Who knows? So with that being said, like, in the event that I'm at these arenas and it's games without fans and there are safety things, I think, number one, like, I'm probably going to think the same thing as the players, where it's weird not having fans. You're so used to that atmosphere, but because of what's been going on these last few months, like, I'd much prefer this than staying at home. And as far as everything else, like, my concerns, frankly, are more just going to be safety than worrying about, hey, where's my seat going to be and what's the locker room access. I don't think the NBA has formalized anything one way or the other, but if I had to guess, I'm sure that there won't be locker room access because they weren't doing that for about a week before they decided to shut everything down. And I think philosophically, this is a whole other discussion for normal times. There is an importance for there to be a locker room access because it's easier to build relationships. It's easier to build trust. But I think in these times, it's totally understandable. But I think my concerns going in is that, hey, what do I do to make sure that I'm not put in anyone's harm's way, and vice versa, right? I'm not going to think too much beyond noticing the weirdness of no fans and just what the atmosphere is like. I think my brain's going to be more on trying to concentrate on the game and do my job, and then also keep in the back of my mind, hey, am I doing everything I need to do to be safe, right? So we'll see what happens.
Mark Medina, he is a basketball reporter for USA Today. Mark, thank you so much for coming on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It was a blast, and wish you continued good health to you and yours moving forward.